Welcome to the reprise of the second talk in celebration of the Society of Scribes' 50th anniversary. The talk originally took place at the School of Visual Arts in early October, and it's now being recorded so that other people can enjoy it. The first talk, which took place in September at the Grolier Club, was devoted to the early years of the Society of Scribes and its origins, with the background on what calligraphy was like in the 20th century in the United States and in England. The third talk actually took place a few days ago and is already online and is devoted to calligraphy in the internet age since 1995. This talk is focused on calligraphy in what I call the boom years, the 1980s and the 1990s. The years in which Society of Scribes was initially growing in size, and then a point at which other calligraphy groups began to emerge, and the society naturally shrunk a bit, but has still been one of the biggest societies in the United States, if not in the world. The talk is not focused solely on Society of Scribes activities, but on looking at what calligraphy was like in those decades, how it changed from the pioneering days of the 70s, and set the stage for where we are in the 21st century. These first two slides are just showing you some of the letterheads done in the 70s and the early 80s for the Society of Scribes. These three are by some of its earliest members. Only Alice was a founding member. Bob Boyajian and Pat Weisberg, though, were very early members. These two, one by myself, channeling some of Lily Ronker's lettering style, and another one by Alice, and one below is very similar to what we still use today. When we had our 10th anniversary, John Stevens, a relatively unknown calligrapher at the time, was asked by myself if he would design a logo for the anniversary. Also, he designed a poster. And this is John's work. You can already see a little more sophisticated letter forms than some of those earlier ones. For that 10th anniversary, I asked Rick Cusick if he would give a keynote speech, and he designed a keepsake for us using his own, with his own lettering. So in the heyday, as I call it, American calligraphy, we've got growth, certainly have controversy, and because of the controversy as well as the growth, we have a breaking up and diversifying of the community. So the first topic that I wanted to address was how word about calligraphy spread, and it spread in a number of ways. As more calligraphic societies joined the original 3 or 4, the early ones were the Society of Scribes in New York, the Calligraphy Society, the Society for Calligraphy in Los Angeles, the Friends of Calligraphy in San Francisco, and the Minnesota, I'm forgetting their name, the Colleagues of Calligraphy. Colleagues of Calligraphy. And then in 1976, the Washington Calligraphy Guild, and after that, there were a number of other ones. I also want to touch briefly upon calligraphy conferences. That's one reason why Maureen Squires was asked to be one of the panelists today, because she was the originator of the first calligraphy conference, the first one in New York, I guess, in New Jersey. The idea of calligraphy teachers traveling, so that we began to have people coming from England and Europe to teach in the United States, as well as people in the United States traveling throughout the country to other guilds and societies. The impact of calligraphy books, which began to boom in the 1980s. There were so few back in the late 60s and the 70s. And then other type of calligraphic publications, specifically newsletters and journals from the societies, but also the forerunner of Letter Arts Review. So I made a little tally of the number of calligraphy societies that existed at certain key moments. And although we talk about the Friends of Calligraphy, the Society of Scribes, the Society for Calligraphy, the Colleagues of Calligraphy as the beginning of the calligraphic boom, there was one society before us, any of us. And that was the Western American branch of the Society for Italic Calligraphy that Lloyd Reynolds at Alfred Fairbanks' urging, established in 1969 in Portland. And so technically they are the first American calligraphy society, though they were devoted initially to italic, and they were considered to be a branch of the British parent society. 1974, we had 3 groups, and then the boom began. The rest of the decade, 41. In the 80s, there were 75 more, 55 more in the 1990s, but we lost 5, for a total of 180 by the time we get to the end of the 20th century. And that includes societies in Europe as well as the United States. But most of the growth is American, and followed by English societies, local ones that were spin-offs of the SSI and its rival, the Calligraphy and Lettering Arts Society, which started in the 1990s. The Calligraphy Connection, organized by the Colleagues of Calligraphy in Minnesota, was the first annual calligraphic conference. And this is a photograph from St. John's University. I don't have other photographs from conferences. The last one was this summer in Iowa at St. Ambrose University. So they've been continuing, with the exception of the pandemic years, for now, over 40 years, the conventions. Traveling calligraphers, these are not all the people. I just, tried to highlight key people. From England, Donald Jackson, of course, is the most important figure, since he's the one who brought the idea of a calligraphy society to Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York in the early 70s. Hella Basu, often kind of forgotten as a British calligrapher, a lettering artist. She died in the early 80s. She came to the United States, brought here by Lily Ronker and the Society of Scribes, and then traveled elsewhere. Yayan Rees and Charles Pierce followed Donald Jackson, and Charles Pierce eventually settled in the United States. David Howells was brought to Los Angeles. I don't know if he ever came to New York.
He did.
He did? Thank you, Barry. Michael Harvey I brought to Society of Scribes in the early 80s, and then from there he ended up teaching at a number of Canadian and American societies for the next 20 years. Peter Thornton was brought a little later in the 80s. I forgot who brought Peter over. And Stan Knight came over, married an American calligrapher, and stayed until his death a few years ago. Hermann Zapf, actually, his impact is because he came to the U.S. at the request of Rochester Institute of Technology to teach a summer course there in the mid-70s. And he taught that course for several years before Julian Waters took it over. And that course had a number of people who took it who then went on to spread Zapf's approach to calligraphy. And Carl Georg Herfer was brought, I think Society of Scribes or Friends of Calligraphy might have been the first to bring him in the 80s, and he helped spread the word about working with a pointed brush in a Western style as opposed to an Asian. Gottfried Pott came a little later and was spreading the word about using different tools, especially ruling pens, linking calligraphy to music. And then I brought Werner Schneider to Fordham, and I think to the Society of Scribes in the late 90s. And Werner, I know, ended up also out in San Francisco that year. I don't think he went anyplace else. I wasn't around when Willu Totes finally came to the U.S. I was out of the country, unfortunately. And I think the Society of Scribes might have been the leaders, or maybe the Washington Calligraphy Guild, in getting Will out. He did a tour of the United States. Not German or British, but Estonian. That's why I separated him on this screen. But he brought a totally different approach to letter forms. If anybody's ever seen any of his books, to realize how different Totes is from any of the other people. So here's work from some of these people, if their names aren't familiar. Painting with Words was a catalog to go with an exhibition in Minnesota of Donald Jackson's work. And there you can see how he was taking things like gilding in a modern contemporary way with this more abstract vision of an angel, sort of thing that he later on brought to the St. John's Bible project. This is a invitation card Lily Ronker designed for the Society of Scribes when we invited Hella Basu here. And I think she died within a year of her tour of the United States in an automobile accident. So quite unfortunate. Because Hella had a very different approach to calling it calligraphy is maybe not correct. She was much more of a letterer, artist, designer, but that's part of what we're talking about today is the fact that the word calligraphy has become more and more elastic over the decades. And if we're trying to be purists, then we're in trouble. You really just have to embrace the fact that it's a bigger tent. And I think Hella's work is one of the earliest examples of this. This is one of my favorite pieces of hers. She did two, Winter is Coming In and Summer is Coming In, from medieval songs. And you can see some of her Indian heritage, meaning India, the country, in the decoration here. That's a silkscreen, by the way. So it's a reproduced bit of lettering work. And that's one of the things that I was instrumental with the Society of Scribes, is trying to broaden calligraphy, to not think about it as simply direct writing as Edward Johnson had it, but also to appreciate letter forms in reproduced manner, whether printed for commercial purposes or in this case as an art piece. What Ye and Rees brought was stone cutting. Ian Rees was, I should say is, he's still alive, thank goodness, a calligrapher and a stone cutter. And he did workshops in both when he came to the United States. And this is an example of his stone cutting. David Howells was always a bit of eccentric when it came to the British lettering tradition. And he was trained in the Johnstonian manner, but he went his own way with his own forms of letters, his own sort of italics, and trying to integrate his lettering often with illustration, with watercolor and other paintings. He eventually married an American calligrapher from Los Angeles who is now still living in England. So there's a lot of interchange between countries that calligraphy has brought about. When Charles Peirce came in the early 80s to the United States, he hooked up with Pentalic, the publishing arm of Lou Strick's business. Lou Strick was the owner of Pentalic and Taplinker Publishing, and he was instrumental in providing places for the Society of Scribes to meet and have workshops in its early years. And he also republished or published afresh many important books in the 70s and into the 80s, and we'll see some of those later on. Among those books are a series that Charles Peirce did for him. Original books, small, usually quite nicely priced, beautifully written, entirely hand done. There is no type, as far as I know, in these books. This is, I think, from the little manual. And if you want to see just, how beautiful and consistent an italic hand can be, this is one example. I don't know how much retouching Charles did. I suspect very little. These are 2 pages from some of the notebooks that Michael Harvey kept as he was planning his various workshops. Before he died, he gave me scans of many of them, which I put up on my website. It's hard for me to choose which ones are the most interesting, and all I know about what he was planning for the workshops comes from these sketches. I chose this one because he's got a little bit of Art Nouveau over there on the left, St. Louis. And he also has, sort of his typical analytical way of approaching things on the right, where he's discussing, different ways that you can change the curve of a letter, and you can have an O that's not your usual round form or your usual flat, squashed, angled Carolingian form or your narrow italic form. Uh, and so Michael was not a calligrapher, though he was really good at faking it if he needed to. He had beautiful handwriting, clearly influenced by calligraphy. He was a stone cutter. He was a book jacket designer, and later in his career, he was a type designer. So he had a wide range of interest in letter forms, and that was what I was bringing him to the U.S. and to teach, and that's what he was doing in the workshops he taught elsewhere later on. Was getting people to see how you could draw letters. And you could draw letters that were calligraphic in their image, but you could also draw letters that were very different, and that's what you're seeing here. Peter Thornton, when he came, did a lot of little small, what do I call them, broadsides, handouts, prints, where he would gang up a lot of his concepts and theories about not only lettering and calligraphy, but about design. This is one of these handouts, these prints that Peter made, I think, for his workshop purpose, but then he sold them. I forget, that's probably how I got my copies. I chose this one because it's got a lot of design concepts, the idea of contrast, and what you can do calligraphically that goes beyond the usual Johnstonian, just, take a text and maybe you have a little gloss on the side. I mean, a lot of this is what was taught at Roehampton over the years. I'm not sure where Peter got his way, but it's some of the, I think these handouts are some of the best things that were done back then if people wanted to broaden their calligraphic designs. An example of Hermann Zapf's work from the 80s, Fine Print was a magazine for people interested in fine press, in private presses and fine printing, but it did occasionally have articles about calligraphy and about digital type design. And for this 10th anniversary issue, the publisher, Sandra Kirschenbaum, invited Hermann Zapf to do the cover. And although, everybody talks about type in that magazine, this is entirely hand done. There is no type. The frame around Hermann's lettering is intended to mimic a chase in a letterpress print. But everything else is hand done by Hermann, and you can see how elegant his approach to Roman capitals are. They're not the Trajan form. They're not anything that's normally taught in the Johnstonian tradition. It's a different, more German approach. I'm sorry, this is a little bit pixelated. I was looking for a really nice example of Carl Georg Hoefer's brush lettering to show how different it was from a broad brush approach of Father Kaddish or a Asian approach to brush calligraphy. And this was the most exciting thing I found online. Unfortunately, not the best digital image, but it says der Pinsel tanzt, which just means the brush dances, and it says die Tusch singt, pardon my German pronunciation, the ink sings. Carl Georg Hoefer went on to make a typeface actually based on those heavier letter forms where you can barely tell it. That's an E, D-E-R at the top, then P-I-N-S-E-L, and then T-A-N-Z-T if you can't read it as clearly as the smaller lettering. This is Gottfried Pott's work. Obviously, it must be a record album cover. I don't know. I just have an image of it. It came from an exhibition at ITC in New York in the 80s. But in the words clavier concert, you can see the use of what I believe is a ruling pen or some other non-traditional tool to create more loose, expressive letter forms. And that's one of the things that begins to take over the 1980s and 90s is a more interest in it being expressive in calligraphy and not being bound to historical forms or foundational forms. And we can really see that in Werner Schneider's work. Both Pott and Schneider were students of Friedrich Poppel, who unfortunately never came to the United States to teach, and so his influence has come more through his students than through himself. And here you can see a ruling pen, probably a homemade one for the title, Eskapaden eines Gassenhauers. And even the small sans serif lettering, I believe, is done with the tip of a homemade ruling pen. I certainly have made lettering in that style using the tip of ruling pens. This is a cover of a sheet music brochure. Werner Schneider did a lot of work for Breitkopf, which is a venerable music publishing company in Germany going back to the 18th century. And this is a book plate, greatly enlarged, obviously, by Willy Totes. And it was one of the things that he and his students and his disciples often did. They did a lot of book plates, if you look at some of the work and the books they produced. Very popular topic, and I think this one shows you the liveliness of Willy Totes' style, though he had so many different ways of working that one image does not encapsulate his work. One thing that you do see here, besides the looseness, is this interest in having narrow and wide letters. Another instance of the contrast that Peter Thornton talked about in his little sheet I showed earlier. Education calligraphically began to spread in the 80s and 90s. In the United States, there used to be calligraphic classes at a lot of art schools until the end of the 60s. And then the impact of Swiss-based design, graphic design, with grids and with sans serif typefaces, began to push out calligraphy classes. Educators didn't see any point in having calligraphy classes when type was not only metal but was going towards photo, and who even needed letterpress workshops. A lot of that stuff, of course, has come back to educational institutions since the 90s. A lot of places have rethought what they threw away in the 60s and early 70s. But that's but the fact that there was a dearth of classes at art schools by the early 70s is one of the reasons that Donald Jackson's visit had such a huge impact, because people now had a place to learn. But along with calligraphic societies, there were some other places. Roehampton Institute was created in England to focus on not just calligraphy but other book arts like bookbinding. Camp Chura was set up in North Carolina by Jim and Joyce Tata, a place where John Stevens has taught for many decades. A place that had existed even earlier in the late 60s, Bernard Arene had his own scriptorium in Toulouse, France. And most of us are aware of the French tradition that Arene has birthed. But it's even affected people outside of France. What's his name? Massimo Palello in Torino is a disciple of Bernard Arene. Reggie Zell set up year-long courses, and I assume Reggie is still doing them. I haven't kept up with things. But the idea of a year-long course was something different, and from what the societies were doing, because the societies tended to be doing 1 day or 2 day weekend courses, occasionally a class that might run for more than one weekend. But what Ezel was doing, and still is, I believe, was giving people a chance to study at a much slower and longer pace without having to enroll in a school like Roehampton. I don't know if the cyber study group still exists. I suspect not. But in the 90s, when the internet showed up, I don't remember who it was, set up a cyber study group to take advantage of the ability to study with people remotely. Now, of course, there are many ways to do that with YouTube videos, Vimeo, as well as classes held by Zoom. So here's Ann Camp, who was the creator and basically the key figure in the Roehampton Institute. A rare example of her actually demonstrated on a board, because everybody tells me that she would only demonstrate on the paper in front of the student to show them how to make things. But Roehampton has given us many of the best known calligraphers of the 80s and 90s and even into the 21st century. Brodie Neuenschwander, Richard Middleton, Christopher Calderhead, excuse me, Margaret Daubney, Sue Houghton, I can name others, Anna Ronke, and a lot of them have spread calligraphy to other countries, to Italy, to Belgium, to Norway. Christopher Hunt has not been strictly in England. The explosion of calligraphy books, and these numbers, I won't vouch for them exactly. I tried to use WorldCat to see what books were published in what years on calligraphy. The problem is, how do you do a search for those? What search terms do you use? If I do calligraphy only, there are a lot of things that will not come up that we would consider calligraphy books, because in their title they have lettering, not calligraphy. Like one of the books that influenced me, Lettering with a Broad Edge Pen by Byron McDonald, which is a calligraphy book, but the word calligraphy is not used. And then there are books that say calligraphy, but they're really catalogs from exhibitions, or they're about Asian calligraphy. So I hope I weeded out the right ones and looked for ones that were not being caught under that rubric. And there were 55, as far as I could tell, that were still in print in the 1970s. But notice, 33 of them were all about learning italic. By the end of the 1980s, we nearly tripled the number, additional to the 55, and almost another tripling additional in the 1990s. By the 1990s, calligraphy had become one of these things there where publishers thought, hey, what are we going to publish a book on that will sell? Oh, I know, calligraphy. And so there were tons of books by people who were not, qualified, and lots of books that look alike. Some of them were published by the same publishers or the same, what do they call them? Book packagers. There were book packagers, especially two of them, Quarto and Quinto in England, that must have done about 10 or more books. And sometimes you'll see the exact same photos and the exact same work, just repackaged. But, even if we discount some of that, clearly there were a lot more ways that calligraphy spread, and people who were not, aware of societies or not close enough to attend and be members of societies could learn calligraphy. I mean, I'm self-taught. I learned from books. Along with just the books that came out from publishers beyond Pentalic and Taplinger, we had two key companies in the United States. Paper and Ink Books, originally started by Brenda Broadbent, and now continued in, I think it's Nashville, Tennessee. Brenda was in Maryland. And John Neal Bookseller. Both of them began almost at the beginning, at the same time, 1980, 1981. John Neal no longer runs his company, but I believe it's somebody else is now running it. So the two businesses are still here, and they began to bring a broader array of books than any of the publishers were doing, importing books from England, from the United States, from Europe, as well as in some cases commissioning books, as John Neal did with Sheila Waters's Important Foundations of Calligraphy. A book that's not from either of those companies, but came out just before the 80s, 1979. Ismar David, one of the early members of the Society of Scribes and a key member in the 80s. He worked for an engrossing firm in New York. He was, I guess, the head of their calligraphic department. And with the support of the owner, they did a very expensive, very complicated publication called Our Calligraphic Heritage. It's a book that people should be aware of if you can find it used. This image gives you an idea of the complexity of it. The book had images of important calligraphic styles, and then it had interpretations of those styles by Ismar David, which are the 17. And then there were designs using calligraphy that David did, the 17 compositions you see there in the blue through the panel. And so you had a book on the left, which was all the historic stuff. On the right, you had Ismar's compositions or designs. And everything came in this little box set, which you could prop up, and you could put your loose sheets in the base of the box so that you could have it as a model to copy and study from. Or you could have the sheets from Ismar as something to inspire you. Friedrich Neugebauer never came to the United States to teach. His influence came from Americans going to him in Austria and then bringing back his ideas, and from Bruce Kennett in Boston, a member of the Letterform Guild in Boston, Lettering Arts Guild, who went to study with Neugebauer and then translated Neugebauer's text so that Neugebauer's book was available to Americans and English readers. The Mystic Art of Written Forms, and you'll find in it, a different approach to letter forms than the Johnstonian approach or even the German approach that Zapf brought. Neugebauer comes out of Rudolf von Larisch's educational tree. And if you don't know the name, at the turn of the 20th century, there were three important figures in reviving interest in lettering and calligraphy. They were Johnston in England, Rudolf Koch in Germany, and Rudolf von Larisch in Vienna. So here we have a second-hand or version of some of von Larisch's thinking. Oops, I'm sorry to go that fast. In the early 80s, 1981, as you can see, Donald Jackson went beyond simply inspiring Americans to establish local calligraphy societies. He was asked by Parker Pens to do a film about the history of writing, and Parker Pens published a book to go with the film. I don't know if the film is available on YouTube. I keep forgetting to look for it. It ought to be. It's famous for a scene in which Donald Jackson, when he's explaining how to do gilding, is showing people how to you poke an egg yolk so you get just the egg yolk and not the skin to put into your gesso, I guess. And he has his pin poised as the egg sac is hanging there. The still photo doesn't quite do the same thing as watching him. But this is the book that came out that published, and it was intended for everyday people to get the history of writing and not to be an academic book, but it's a serious book. Excuse me. With excellent images. The cover of one of Charles Peirce's books, I'm not sure if it's the same one I showed you the interior earlier. There's other versions that are in purple or burgundy. Some of them are just reprints from other years. They're not, the content is the same. But these books were as cheap as like $3. I don't know what they go for used, but they're really worth buying if you're serious about studying calligraphy. You can see the variety of styles that Peirce is covering in this book. It's not just italic, but he's also covering uncial. He's covering, I guess, a sort of Gothicized italic, a textura, in this case, capitalis quadrata, square capitals, and Carolingian. Along with the books, one of the things that Charles Peirce did with Pentalic was they produced calligraphy practice pads. I mean, most people made their own, following instructions from their teachers, drawing guidelines, drawing any helpful vertical or slant lines. But Pentalic came out with several practice pads, and you can see this one. This one is designed for a B3 nib. There must have been others I've forgotten. This is one I still have for other sizes of nibs. And not only do you get, the pad, but you also get a nice example of Charles Peirce's, terrific calligraphy. Stan Knight, who passed away a couple years ago in the early '80s with calligrapher Marcia Friedman as his designer, did a book called Historical Scripts. Came out from, I believe, Oak Knoll Press originally, and got revised in the late '90s with improved photography and a nicer cover. But the basic content was the same, and it's a fabulous book. Stan, in 2 pages, gives you really, a terrific introduction to all the key styles in Western calligraphy. You're only seeing 1 page here. On the left side is a full page of a manuscript, and then on the right page you'll have a detail enlarged, which you see at the top, and down below he'll either have a detail at real size, or in this case a detail from another related manuscript. The text gives you all the historical, bibliographical, paleographical information you might need if you want to study the manuscript on your own by going to whatever institution owns it. And then in just a couple paragraphs he tells you what's important about it and what to look at. I mean, this is the way most books ought to be when it comes to studying calligraphy or type. Hermann Zapf in the mid-'80s was asked by Rotring, a German pen company, to do a small introductory book on calligraphy for people who couldn't attend classes of his at RIT. Zapf did not go around traveling as a calligrapher, and he wasn't teaching in Germany. And we're lucky he agreed to do this book. There's actually several versions of the book for different languages, and because they're for different languages, they have some differences in the alphabet models that they include. So with the Spanish version, you get rotunda, and I believe with the French one, you get petard, which you don't necessarily get with the English one here. But in these books, Zapf showed, not just the things we expected to see in calligraphy books, but he showed some of his tricks and techniques and hints, ways to do things that supposedly you cannot do calligraphically. He would change the pen angle in the middle of doing a stroke. He would have multiple pen angles for making a letter. He would turn the nib on its corner. He would partly draw and partly write. Things that other people often did, but things that were usually not mentioned in calligraphy books, and often were not mentioned in calligraphy workshops. Now, most people probably in the calligraphy world aren't familiar with this man, Hermann Zapf. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was a teacher in Holland and The Hague in a design school, and he taught a class devoted to letter forms, basically. Outside of teaching, he was a book jacket designer, and he often did calligraphic book jackets. At one point, he apparently found that the way to make things faster and cheaper was he turned his calligraphy into personal typefaces that he could, access through photographic means in the pre-computer era. Where he could print out his letter forms and then cut them up and assemble them. And it wasn't, his direct calligraphy, but it was his calligraphy. And in his teaching, he tried to join the pointed pen and the broad pen traditions and show how they really were part of different just ways of looking at letter forms. So the broad pen way of looking at letter forms was that you had a plane moving through space. That is, the front of the broad nib, as it moves, by the angle you hold it at and the direction and all, you create your thicks and thins. With the pointed tool, he said what's happening is not translation. He used the term translation to refer to the broad pen because it's a mathematical term for moving through two-dimensional space. With the pointed pen, he used the term expansion because the pointed pen, to create its thicks and thins, you need to spread the nib allow more ink to come down or to close the nib up and restrict the flow of ink. So you're expanding the nib. And he created a chart for this book on his theory of writing to show you what could be done depending upon how you worked with the letter form. Well, strangely enough, this book, which originally was done in 1981, anticipated, we now talk about variable fonts, the idea of a cube, a structure for letter forms. And it's not surprising that Mr. Nordzai's students went on to be some of the most important early designers of digital typefaces in the late 80s and early 90s. But they came out of a calligraphic educational background. And although this book is now considered a Bible among type designers, it's a book which I think calligraphers should be aware of as well. Edward Johnston's influence continued in the 80s and 90s. Heather Child and Justin Howes collaborated on 2 books, bringing some of Johnston's unpublished writings into print. Johnston was unable to complete his second book because he was such a perfectionist that he kept putting off and rewriting. And so finally, long after he had died in 1944, Heather Child and Justin Howes collaborated to bring that manuscript as well as other writings that he had done either for specific classes or just his thinking to himself about writing. And I think these books have influenced people because they give us a very different view of Johnston, a lot looser than you get from writing, illuminating, and lettering. I'm not showing you anything besides the cover of this first book, Lessons in Formal Writing. The other one's, I think, called Formal Penmanship and Other Writing. The Calligrapher's Handbook originally was published in the mid-50s. And then it got, I see a typo in my caption, sorry. In the mid-'80s, Lou Strick and Pantalic, with Heather Child and a whole group of people, brought out a revised version, updating a lot of the topics in there, about vellum, about illumination, about gold leaf, about different styles of writing, about cutting quills, etc., etc. The cover for this edition, at least the cover I've got, is another ones I've seen online, was designed by Donald Jackson. That's his lettering or his calligraphy. But this book I think ought to be updated. There ought to be another edition. I don't know why it's out of print. It's anybody interested in calligraphy in its more traditional sense. It's a book that's still essential to have. I mentioned Michael Harvey being somebody who brought more a drawing approach to letter forms, and Michael was asked by publishers in England and then their associates in the United States to do a series of books on lettering, one on carving letters, one on drawing letters, one on digital, I believe, letter forms, and then there's a compendium of several of them. This one, Sheila Waters did the introduction to, and this is, a book that tells you, how you can draw letter forms. And can be ones that look calligraphic or ones that look Art Nouveau or any other way. And I'm showing you these things because these books are broadening, the world of calligraphy, what lettering can be, interest in lettering. A book by somebody who unfortunately died almost 20 years ago. I forget when Kay Atkins died. But Kay was a student of Howard Glasser's at Southeastern Massachusetts University. Howard designed her book. That's his calligraphy in white on top of the historical document in blue, and this is the cover. But Kay, with Howard's consultation, did a book that was, looking at all the masters of the italic letter historically, all the people who used to do writing books in the 16th century. Arrighi, Tagliente, Palatino, Neudorfer, and it's a book that's unfortunately out of print that David Godine published, and it's another one I would highly recommend to people. It's beautifully designed by Howard, and Kay gives you nice, short bios of these writing masters and samples of their work. And Martin Anders is probably even less known than people like Werner Schneider in the United States. I only know him because of this book, which got translated into English. This is the original German edition, Spuren, Zeichen, Buchstaben, which I think is what? Zeichen is marks, Buchstaben is letters. I forgot what Spuren is. I forgot the translation into English. But Anders was a longtime teacher in Hamburg, Germany. When he retired, Jovica Veljovic took over his position, and Jovica has now retired a year or so ago. I'm not sure who's the lettering arts teacher in Hamburg, but Anders had his own way of teaching people to learn about lettering and about type that had to do with mark making and what tools could do, even just tongue depressors and other simple tools. His book is very different. It does not have formal alphabet models, but when his book got translated in English, I think it began to inspire a number of people who were looking for a more expressive approach to calligraphy. Words of Risk, a catalog that Michael Gulick did, surveying what Thomas Ingmeier had been doing for roughly a decade. I think it was an important landmark. Ingmeier, I think, is the key person in urging calligraphers to look at what they did as art and to look at artists, especially abstract painters of the 1950s, as models for how they could go beyond thinking of themselves as scribes or just people who are copying out quotations and texts, but how you can collage things together. I mean, Ingmeier has gone way beyond what he was doing in the 1980s. Since then, he's worked with poets and with artists from other traditions to do work. And other people have, taken up, different approaches to the mantle of calligraphy as art since then, whether it's Monica Dango in Italy, Denise Locke in France, Brody Neuenschwander in Belgium. We've now got a whole another way of looking at calligraphy that simply at the scribal approach, or the wedding invitation approach, or the doing announcements and proclamations for royal members in England. I mentioned earlier that the Society of Scribes' 10th anniversary was in 1984. Its 25th was in 1999. And for that, the Society had a large exhibition at AIGA in New York, the design organization's headquarters, back when they still had headquarters that were ground level. And out of the exhibition came a catalog designed by Jerry Kelly with a cover that has Alice's lettering embossed in gold, and behind it, I believe, Raphael Boguslav's lettering in red. A survey of 20th century calligraphy. I assume the book is still available, possibly from the Grolier Club, or I think David Godine published it. But what this book did is what other books had done earlier. Sort of a survey of the state of calligraphy at a particular moment. In the 30s, there was a book from Studio Publishing in England looking at calligraphy, and then Studio did another one, if I remember correctly, in the early 50s, and then Heather Child did one in the mid-60s, and then in the early 80s, ITC had an exhibition in New York, a type company, and that was published by Watson Guptill. And we had this one so that, every 10, 15 years, there was sort of a snapshot. I don't know if we can do one like that anymore, if anybody's willing to do it, to see what the snapshot of calligraphy in 2025 is, or in 2015, what it was. I mentioned calligraphic magazines and journals early on. Calligraphy Idea Exchange was the original name for a magazine published by friends of Arthur Baker's and people eager to spread his views on how calligraphy should be done. It got bought up by Karen Gilman and name changed to Calligraphy Review. And then after a while, Karen, probably at the urging of Rick Cusick, her art director, changed the name to Letter Arts Review to reflect the fact that it wasn't about calligraphy in the narrow dictionary definition. And Letter Arts Review continues today. John Neal, bookseller, took it over from Karen Gilman, and then a couple years ago, Seaview Press in Florida is continuing it, and Christopher Calderhead has been the art director and editor now for, I guess, 20 years. Calligraphy Quarterly was a Society of Scribes attempt at a journal. Only lasted a couple years, started in 1979. Alphabet, which is still going, was started by the Friends of Calligraphy. It's had a number of editors, has been in charge for what feels like forever, but turning out terrific work. And I think Alphabet is one of the best places if you want to see what's happening in calligraphy, but also what happened in the past, because Carl's got a nice historical sense. Scripsit is the Washington Calligraphy Guild's journal, and it's been going for a number of decades. For a couple years, Julian Waters was editor and designer. For many issues were done by Michael Clark. I think some of the best issues where Michael, was given free range to talk about, show whatever was interested him. He had Russian calligraphers. He had all sorts of things that, if you weren't paying attention online, you would not know existed. Quill didn't exist long. It had only a couple issues. Susan Skarsgård did it for the Michigan Calligraphers Guild. What was important about Quill was that she really, she managed to get Mohawk paper to contribute money, and so she was able to, design-wise, do probably the most ambitious issue of any calligraphy society's magazine. So here's one of the covers of Calligraphy Quarterly, calligraphy by Robert Rubian. I think he was president of the Society of Scribes at the time, as well as art director for the magazine. I can't remember if I was editor or just a contributor back then. But this was after Lloyd Reynolds had passed away in 1978. So that's Lloyd Reynolds teaching probably at Reed College. Whoops, sorry. This is Washington Calligraphers Guild, an issue designed by Julian Waters and partially letterpress printed with typefaces by Hermann Zapf at the bottom there in blue and very faint, off-white, where it says Scripsit, February 1981. The calligraphy in the middle is a detail from Hans Joachim Burgert's work, and that's a name that is not probably well known in the United States. Burgert was a German calligrapher, musician, book designer, private press printer, artist, sculptor, who had his own theories about calligraphy. He didn't like the word calligraphy. He was more interested in writing, but his ideas were translated by Brody Neuschwander into English and published in a very limited edition. It was called Dot the Eye. I'm not sure if you can still get Brody's translation, but it influenced a number of people in England and elsewhere who got copies of that magazine. And other than that, I'm not sure how many people have been aware of Burgert's work. You can see it now in the Calligraphy Museum in Berlin. Alphabet, I mentioned, Carl Rohrs is the current editor of it. This is, I think, done when John Prestiani was the editor, if I remember, 1985. Marcia Friedman's been editor. I've been editor. Terry Louie's been editor. Georgiana Greenwood was the editor of its predecessor, the newsletter. I'm sure I'm forgetting some of the other people who've contributed to its excellence over what is now over 40 years. This particular cover I chose because it has Rick Cusick's calligraphy on it. In fact, you might see the same alphabet that he used for our 1984 Society of Scribes keepsake poster. If you don't know Rick's name, by the way, Rick, he's retired now, but Rick for decades was the lead calligrapher at Hallmark Cards from the mid-60s until 4 or 5 years ago. This is just the cover of the amazing issue that Susan Skarsgård did of Quill, that Mohawk made available to a wider audience in the design world. So you can see there's a die cut, little windows, and a die cut of the white part of the paper that flips open so you can see the rest of the green and blue calligraphy at the bottom. And that's Susan's calligraphy embossed onto the front, and I believe it's Vilo Totes' calligraphy that's hidden through the windows and the bottom. Calligraphy Idea Exchange. This is issue 1 with calligraphy by Arthur Baker, though the logo is by Bob Boyajian, Society of Scribes member. It was the charter issue. And you can see Arthur Baker's interest in pattern making through letter forms. That's just the letter I over and over again, sort of a mandala. Calligraphy Review, an issue from, I believe, the 90s with Suzanne Moore's work. When I mentioned people broadening calligraphy beyond the scribal tradition, Suzanne Moore is important in the world of bookmaking, of doing books which involve more artistic elements along with just straight writing. In this case, I think it's where she's working with the Cherokee syllabary, which has fascinated me for years. And Suzanne is one of several calligraphers, Nancy Levitt's another, who've taken calligraphy in interesting ways into the book world. A later issue, this is Letter Arts Review, with Mike Gold and Judy Melvin, two, well, I think they retired now, former members of American Greeting Cards lettering staff, calligraphy staff, who often collaborated on artwork. So I can't tell you which of the two did which parts of the lettering here. But Mike and Judy certainly were interested in expanding, working with calligraphy in a more expressive way, but also working with different tools, combining techniques. Mike has done a number of workshops on that, and you can see a lot of their work in issues of Letter Arts Review. Calligraphy as craft was not ignored in the 80s and 90s, although I've been emphasizing the move away from calligraphy as craft. A couple of the key events of those 2 decades are 2 books, Under Milkwood, project that Sheila Waters had begun decades before but finally completed during this period, and the St. John's Bible, overseen by Donald Jackson with a team of calligraphers. And I put Nancy Levitt's name here because although I mentioned her with Suzanne Moore in working in the book arts world, Nancy has stuck to fairly traditional letter forms. So here is the blind embossed cover of the printed version of Under Milkwood. Under Milkwood was a manuscript that Sheila Waters did for a private collector, a one-of-a-kind on vellum. And then, I think was it through John Neal or just through Sheila directly, a printed version was made available. And so you're seeing the embossed cover of the printed version and a page from it with Sheila's illustration as well as her modernized Carolingian alphabet, which grew out of this project that she taught for many years and other people have taught after her. One of the few spreads I could swipe from the internet that actually showed you something useful from the St. John's Bible. They really have tried to block the damn thing off from everybody, which I don't understand. I mean, I know they want you to buy all the books they've published on it, but I mean, they really should be spreading this. You can see even here the image is a bit pixelated. But what I wanted to show from the St. John's Bible is that Donald Jackson wanted a Bible that was of the 20th or 21st century. A Bible whose imagery would not be a traditional, gilding, illumination, and heraldry that we see in all the famous Bibles, and even the lettering, the calligraphy, would be modernized interpretations of traditional hands. And Donald, came up with several models that the other calligraphers, were expected to copy, but of course they were not going to be copying it exactly. They'd all have individual, qualities, so that, it's a team effort. And just like we can look at older manuscripts and say, oh, there's scribe A, there's scribe B, there's scribe C. People will look at this in the future and say, oh, there's scribe H, and there's scribe, J or whatever. There are a lot of, if people haven't, can't see the Bible in person in Minnesota, there are a number of books that St. John's has published about the making of the Bible. Christopher Calderhead was the editor of that, as well as some of the different parts of the Bible. Calligraphy as art is not my interest in the world of calligraphy, but as an historian, I try to look at everything that's going on, and to me that was the most important trend in the 80s and 90s, was moving away from calligraphy as craft towards calligraphy as art. And I've mentioned a number of these names already as people who have been influential in that. Thomas Ingmar, Suzanne Moore, Brody Neuschwander, Monica Dango, Mike Gold, and Judy Melvin. People I didn't mention earlier, Dick Beasley, who was doing what he called sync art, a way of doing multiple styles on a single piece of paper, running them through water in the sink, adding watercolors, colored pencil, all sorts of things. Jenny Grote, who always brought a sort of Asian approach, working with a pointed brush in her work, and influenced by her own training as a dancer. Dennis Brown, trained in the Roehampton way, has broadened his look at what calligraphy as an art can be, sometimes working on layers of glass that have been put together so you can see through them, as well as working on animal skins that he's burnt and doctored in various ways to sort of update the traditional scribal tradition. And I mentioned Bergert and Laurie Doctor's work and Louis Grunewald's work, or other people. I mean, this is not comprehensive what I'm talking about today. So if anybody says, well, where's so-and-so? My apologies to so-and-so. I've tried to pick out the names that I've, just heard about and noticed and caught my eye over the years in reading Letter Arts Review or Alphabet or other sources. So here's Ingmar's work. I showed you the cover of the catalog that Michael Gullick did earlier, and this is, I think, the most famous of the pieces Ingmar did in his early career, Saucy Jacks. And you can see the influence of his training in England in some of the letter forms. And Ingmar has gone beyond simply doing alphabets into much more focused on abstraction or on poetic texts. And an example of Judy Melvin's work, I don't have a date for it, but you can see how different it is from that collaborative piece with Mike Gold. I didn't put Carl Kurtz's name up there. I probably should have. Unfortunately, Carl died almost a decade ago now. I never met him in person. I only corresponded with him. He was a designer in the Midwest, and he would submit this work to Letter Arts Review that just always astonished me. And that's how I got in touch with him. And it turns out most of these pieces that look like they're just abstractions are actually texts. There's actually something said. Sometimes I can decipher them. Other times, like this one, I have no idea. And unfortunately, he's not around to ask anymore what it is, but it's beautiful. And it turned out when I began conversing with Carl that a lot of this stuff that looks like it's just dashed off was carefully drawn with a pencil and redrawn and refined and then, done in ink or turned into a linoleum block cut. I mean, so when we see an image, we often have no idea how it was made. Its process is sometimes opaque to us. I don't think that means that we should, denigrate it or see it as anything less. It's, it is what it is, and in this case, it's beautiful. I didn't mention Ewan Clayton in my overall summary. Ewan, another Roehampton graduate who's moved away from straight scribal writing, though he obviously can do it. He's been playing with, what the pen can do, not necessarily in a wild, expressive way, a more controlled way, and making up his own sort of alphabet and letter forms, like the ones in this example. If you look at letters like the top where it says "What is time?" At first glance, they may not be legible, but they're much more legible in Karl Kurtz. At the bottom, it says "With a sign to unchosen paths." Karina Meister, a friend of mine in Amsterdam, an original member of Scriptoris, the Dutch calligraphy group, which I could not find looking for it when I was doing my last talk. I hope they're still around. Karina was trained by both Chris Brand, who was a Dutch designer and handwriting exponent, and did one typeface. So somebody with a more traditional Alfred Fairbanks sort of background, and she was trained by Herbert Post, a German type designer and calligrapher who comes from the Rudolf Koch tradition. Karina's gone in her own direction. She was a graphic designer and basically a book artist and calligrapher. This is a detail from a book she did about a trip she made to the United States. I think you can see a few words. Is it the fall? The fail? But her work works all sorts of tools, eyedroppers, sticks, twigs she finds, and she collages things in. She's been influenced by Arabic calligraphy in recent years. She studied the language as well as Arabic calligraphy. But she doesn't do Arabic calligraphy, unlike Eleanor Holland, who was our guest at the third lecture a few days ago. We can't ignore Brody Neuschwander in looking at this direction, and this is not an example really of Brody doing calligraphy as art or expanding the book arts world. This is Brody working with Peter Greenaway, the film director. The two have worked together now for several decades, not just on film, but on various spectacles, I think on opera, theater presentations. But this is where they started. The book is called The Pillow Book, and the book involves these two lovers in which the man is writing on the woman's skin. And so Peter Greenaway hired Brody Neuschwander to be the calligrapher for at least the English words. It was an Asian calligrapher. And I was always disappointed by the fact that Brody just did alphabets and phrases like "pen is mightier than the sword." It sort of just ruined the atmosphere of the movie to see a phrase like that. But it was something new to see somebody, a calligrapher, in the film industry, not doing a title to a film, but actually, as part of the content of the movie. Um, and it certainly launched Brody into working in much broader worlds than we would have expected. I mean, if you go onto his website, you'll see, as I said, spectacle and jewelry and all sorts of things beyond what we assume calligraphy is supposed to be about. And I think Brody continues to be a great, exemplar and inspiration. My interest is in calligraphy as a reproductive art, and that's why there's a section on calligraphy and graphic design. And this is some of the people who inspired me and continue to inspire me. Tim Gervin, I put at the top because I think Tim Gervin is crucial and somebody who just doesn't get noticed in the calligraphy world. I mean, if you go to Tim's website, I mean, he talks about calligraphy. But Tim's been in the world of branding and graphic design for so long that unless you see his website, you don't know he exists. But he studied calligraphy while a student in the 70s through Lloyd Reynolds. Though he wasn't a Reed College student, he was at Evergreen College outside of Seattle. And he's always kept what he learned there as part of his work, even when he does things that aren't. Some of these people, unfortunately, are no longer with us. Larry Brady, Sherry Brigham, Georgia Deaver, way too many names. David Mecklenburg. I hope Brenda Walton's still with us. I don't remember. This is once again just some of the names. There are other people I could list, but here's some of their work so you can see it. John Stevens for an exhibition, for a competition exhibition that I organized for the Society of Scribes in 1984 called Calligraphy and the Graphic Arts. This is where John first came to the notice of the New York calligraphy world. He did a poster for our 10th anniversary, an exhibition. This is Tim Gervin for a defunct bank annual report. And what's important about Tim's work is that Tim went away from just following classical calligraphic styles. I mean, this is a broad pen with deliberate bumps and nicks and things. It's italic, but it's not Arrighi. It's not Alfred Fairbank. It's not Johnston. Design agencies and ad agencies, when they saw this stuff, they're like, oh, that can be calligraphy? It doesn't have to be this just, like chancery italic? And I think Tim opened up a world for a lot of us in the 80s. And he got his break by Herb Lubalin profiling his work in upper and lower case in the late 70s. Georgia Deaver for a company making filing cabinets. And you can see Georgia working with a brush here. So some of her work, you'll find both Tim and Georgia work with brushes as well as pens. I think this is the most amazing piece John Stevens has ever done. I don't know how many hours it took him to do. Headliners was a company that made phototype and also Identicolor, which was if I remember correctly, a system for proofing color for printing mock-ups in the pre-digital era. I mean, this is the digital era, but for digital tools took over. And I got asked to do a design copying John's, nowhere near as nice, and I'm sure other people did too, this idea of collaging different calligraphic styles to represent a topic, in this case just the year, 1987. Julian Waters, I think my favorite of all his projects was this collection of U.S. commemorative stamps for Wildlife America that he did. That's his calligraphy on the cover, and then inside there are all these little stamp designs that he did with, like, I don't know how many different calligraphic styles, like 20. Sherry Brigham, who's no longer with us, did a lot of work for packaging. Her brush lettering is much nicer than the graphic design it got used with. It's just too bad. But Sherry was an important person in getting the brush to be accepted. American calligraphers, not just Carl Georg Herfer and Georgia Deaver. Iskra, Another one-named designer like Alice, Seattle-based designer and artist and illustrator. I think she emphasizes illustration more and more today. But she's done a lot of work in the world of graphic design with brush-based letter forms. Emily Shields, unfortunately, Emily, one of the early Society of Scribes members, went to work for Stu Ben Glass as Alice and Anna Pinto did later, joining Pat Weisberg, who had been on staff for years. And they brought their calligraphy into the world of etching on glass. And here's one example of Emily's calligraphy on a glass that honors musicians, composers. Jackie Sakwa, she's now a teacher, a regular teacher in Massachusetts school, but she was a calligrapher in the 80s and 90s, and a lot of her work was done for David Godine, who was an important publisher of books on calligraphy and type. And this is a catalog for some. This is just her calligraphy, very roughly. Other catalog covers have more polished versions of her italic. Richard Lipton also did a lot of work for Godine, and both Richard and Jackie worked for a while for Bitstream, one of the earliest digital type companies, and brought their calligraphic style to typefaces. Jackie only did one, but Richard has continued in the world of digital type design. He has his own company now. Just to show his lettering work and a variety of it, this collage of covers for Twain publishers from the 80s I thought was a good single image to show how versatile he is, including the pointed pen style there for Eugene O'Neill. Gene Evans, another person who was briefly at Bitstream in the early 80s, self-taught calligrapher as far as I know, and she did all sorts of work in the 80s and 90s in the design world. And this is for Northeastern University Press. And I think the entire design is sort of included the typography, but I can't be sure. David Meckelberg created a series of greeting cards, sort of an alternative to Hallmark or American Greetings or Norcross, the big greeting card companies of the day. And his greeting cards are usually known for their color, their use of color. Often the calligraphy was in multiple colors. And most of the time it was either just this italic or his simple Roman caps inspired by Roehampton. The Meckelberg was not a Roehampton student. He was a Corita Kent student. And the color certainly comes out of Sister Corita Kent's work. But I think David had one of the nicest italic hands I've ever come across. That's my work for a CD cover for Diana Krall's Love Scenes. And I've emphasized the brush in this presentation, but the brush wasn't the only way of breaking away from tradition in the calligraphy world in the 80s and 90s. It was looking at other tools that could be used beyond a brush, whether a pointed brush or a broad brush or a regular broad metal pen or quill. A man named Ben Braun, a member of the Society of Scribes, created a plastic quill, which I know Bob Boyajian used, and who else used it. A number of people came up with broad metal pens as alternatives to the automatic pens that were produced by a British company. Coit, an American company in Connecticut, was making pens that Arthur Baker promoted. Charles Lozada, a Society of Scribes member from New Jersey, began to make his own versions. Powell pens were made later, and I'm sure there's other people who've made metal pens for doing large broad pen calligraphy. Ruling pen was inspired by the work of Gottfried Pott, Werner Schneider, and Friedrich Poppel. They often work with homemade ruling pens, but other people discovered you could take traditional ruling pens, you could modify them as well as making your own. And then people discovered you could take metal from pop soda cans and cut out the metal and bend it and tape it together and put it, add it to a stick, and all of a sudden you had people called cola pens. Though unfortunately the metal for soda cans over the years no longer works as well, as it's got plasticized. It's no longer the same pure metal it was when people began doing this in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. But from doing pens like that and seeing the homemade pens that Friedrich Poppel had made, the ruling writer was created, Laurie. I forgot Laurie's last name now. And then other people since Laurie have made their equivalent of homemade ruling pens that you can buy from John Neal or from Paper and Ink Books. People like, and it wasn't just Karina Meister, and some of the others I've talked about, who used tongue depressors, wooden sticks, reeds, all sorts of things. Jovica Veljovic was using that stuff in the early 80s, and some of the calligraphy he did that first brought him to the attention of people in the United States. And then people like Carl Rohrs and others discovered these Japanese pentel brushes, these fiber brushes that, you didn't have to worry about all the maintenance of a regular brush, and you could just, have a little cover to it, and you could carry it with you and not have to worry about ink and stuff. And so, brushes like that have influenced people. Pipettes, using droppers to make your marks, using just regular felt tip and magic markers, and more and more. I mean, all people have said, hey, what can I use to make marks? The world of calligraphy has become the world of mark making. So a few images about this. So Cutting a Quill, for those who don't know, this is from The Story of Writing that I mentioned earlier as an important book by Donald Jackson from Parker Pen. And I was surprised that when I was looking for an image of somebody cutting a quill, or cutting a bamboo pen, I found Hans Meyer, a name you might not know. Hans, who unfortunately passed away, was a Swiss educator and type designer. He wrote a book called The Development of Writing, which I think is being issued again in a new version. It's a very simple book with his own calligraphy for all the historical styles and no real instruction, just a set of styles. But here he is carving a bamboo pen, and then you can see, adding the metal reservoir from, I think, a Coca-Cola can, judging by the red and white. This is Bob Boyajian, the Twin Rockers, written with a split Coit pen. Coit began designing pens that had gaps in the teeth, so you could have stripes in your lettering. I think automatic pens began to copy them later on. The smaller writing is done with a brawn plastic quill. And that's for a workshop on paper making that the Society of Scribes did in, I think it was the late 70s. I don't think it was the early 80s. I think it was 79. Jean Larcher, another person who's passed away, had the most amazing pointed pen writing. He could do it bigger than anybody I know. That's from an envelope to James Moseley, but I've got envelopes like that he sent to me where the lettering has got to be like an inch or inch and a half in height. And it's not drawn, it's not retouched, it's done directly. Rachel Yallop is continuing Jean's approach to pointed pen writing. You can see some of his influence in her way of making certain letters. What you're seeing below that envelope is Jean's drawn lettering inspired by pointed pen models, and especially the work of Tony DeSpina and Herb LeBallen's colleagues in the United States, where it's not calligraphy, it's lettering. But there are people now interested in this style and how do you do this, and not just how do you write directly. Mike Keksick has taken the pointed pen and tried to move beyond the round hand style, the style of George Bickham and Platt Rogers Spencer, and the pointed pen that we've assumed for so long, and created his own uncial and his own, I don't know what some of these styles are. You can see the uncial in Heart and Soul, but you can see in the large lettering and in the interwoven lettering, there's no name for it. We'll just call it Kecksig style. A sample of some of my friend Karina's tools. There's more than this. This is just one photo I took. I don't even know what a lot of these things are. You can see a homemade ruling pen down here. You can see a different type of broad pen made from some sort of metal. I'm not sure if it comes from a soda can or some other metal container. You can see felt added to a stick, just two different ends for two different sizes. You can see a lot of different wooden sticks that have been shaved down in different ways. You can see just pointed sticks. I think that's probably a bird quill. Those are reeds. That's a reed that's been sharpened. Another quill, metal pen, another reed. This is a type of sponge brush. That's a pipette. I don't know what the rest of these are. That's a bird quill. Here you can see Jovica Veljovic from the early 80s working with a wooden stick, and obviously shifting his ink as he worked. Here you can see a spread from Letter Arts Review where I wrote an article trying to talk about the ruling pen in 1995 when people were curious. And I did a historical dive into it and got as many photographs of tools from as many of the contributors as I could. What you're seeing in the upper left are some of Friedrich Poppel's homemade tools made by his father-in-law. And the other images here are from draftsman sets, and these are modified regular ruling pens that have been shaven down on whetstones. And these are some of the tools I owned, some of the ones made by Lori and just regular ones. Michael Clark writing with a ruling pen. And Michael was the ultimate person in advocating writing with untraditional tools. I mean, he had so many different methods and tools, it's amazing. From brush writing, Marilyn Reeves and Liza Schulte, showing you all the different types of brushes for writing with a pointed brush, so it's not including the Pentel color brush right here. Glenn Epstein did another. Carl Rohrs told me he did all of this with the Pentel brush. That was not done by Carl. This was done either by Glenn or by Jacobson. Oh, what's her name? Cheryl. Yeah, Cheryl Jacobson. Uncredited calligraphy. I think this is hers. Oh no, no. I think this is not Carl's. Anyway, new techniques in the 80s and 90s. So this is a traditional technique. This is from one of the revived books of Edward Johnston's teaching, Formal Penmanship and Other Papers. That came out actually in the 70s before the other one that I mentioned. And this is, how you do it. You figure out what the pen angle is, and that determines the thickness of your writing line. And you don't vary it. Well, Arthur Baker began playing around with pens and doing books and not, with no text to them. And people would look at them and say, well, wait a minute. That can't be a stroke that's been done with a pen at the same angle. How's he doing this stuff? Well, eventually, Baker in the 80s began doing a whole ton of books where he would show what he was doing through this method of the hand. And you can see the pen actually is changing its angle depending upon where it is in the stroke. This was described as pen twisting, as pen manipulation, and it caused a huge controversy. There were people arguing over whether you could do it or not, whether it was acceptable, people arguing over whether it was done in the past by scribes and just not talked about. It was a huge uproar, which looks like a tempest in a teapot in retrospect. But here's some of Arthur's work from those books where it was just samples of calligraphy with no explanation, no drawings, no nothing. And you can clearly see the changing of the pen angle in strokes like this. And I think, whether people liked Baker's work or liked him personally, his work has had a huge influence, simply one through the sheer number of books he did, but also because they were so different from all the other calligraphy books that used to exist. One of his early disciples was Philip Bousma, and this is work he did for the Society of Scribes Calligraphy Journal. Gunnlaugur Briem, Icelandic calligrapher, studied in England, living now in Spain, did a little book on what he called the Icelandic method of doing chancery cursive. And what I liked about the book was the entire book is hand done. I think his model is beautiful, and he's just showing you how to do it with a pointed tool. That you can make italic calligraphy without a broad tool. It's the structure of the letter. And for handwriting, then you can just use a ballpoint pen or a pencil. This book is available as a digital download for free from Gunnlaugur. So if people never got the original printed version, I think it's a terrific educational resource. Gene Evans, as far as I can tell, did this word silver for a telephone company, 9X, by taking either an automatic pen or a Coit pen and pushing it down rather than pulling it down, and thus getting these odd shapes, pushing and pulling, because I've recreated this effect myself trying to use a pen that way. So, not just using new tools, but using them in ways that are considered to be wrong. I mentioned Hermann Zapf giving away some of his secrets in the calligraphy books, little booklets he did in the 80s for Rotring, and this is one page showing some of those things. So you can see here where he's showing you can rotate the pen, from one angle to another to get this serif on a capital E or a capital F. And you can do a different thing for the bottom of the serif on those letters. Or you can even take your pen, and if it's flexible enough, you can split the nib and only write on one side of it, which is a technique that calligraphers with quills apparently did for centuries, because you can see it in Ewan Clayton's book on the golden, what was it called? The golden, I'm forgetting the name of his book. But in his book, which is a history of writing, and a very good one, he talks about calligraphers doing this split nib thing with quills. It has to be a flexible enough tool. I think Browser pens that I like are a bit too stiff for that. And here are some other examples of how you can build up your letters using the pen as opposed to drawing in a Michael Harvey way. And you can see some of that influence of Zapf in this Finnish calligrapher's work. And here in Pat Weisberg's work, you can see manipulation of the pen. So people were doing it who come out of different traditions than Arthur Baker, and that's part of the complaint about him was he wanted to claim sole credit for the idea of breaking with this tradition. But there were people who were doing it either consciously or unconsciously, who'd come from other traditions. Their work looks different from his, and it should. Everybody's unique. And here's Carl Rohrs, who, like Michael Clark, I think has been one of the biggest influences in past decades of, trying to figure out how people did things. And Carl has, sort of reverse engineered the work of some of the German and Estonian and Austrian calligraphers and some of their typefaces and said, well, here's how you could make this with a broad edge tool or with a pointed brush. And this is what he calls the Linz bounce, based on the work of Alfred Linz, a unfortunately deceased Austrian calligrapher whose work was discovered through ITC and the promotion of Hermann Zapf. So here you see Carl explaining the ductus. And finally, the last part, and I know this has gone way longer than I promised my co-panelists, but it's YouTube or whatever. People can watch this, in bits and pieces if they want. No one has to sit through the whole thing at one time. But one thing about calligraphy in the 80s and 90s is that when the computer came in, on the one hand, it seemed to be the death of calligraphy. People all had their own fonts. On the other hand, it made a big revival. I mean, the graphic design work I did in the 90s with calligraphy and a lot of other people came about because there were clients who all of a sudden wanted something that showed the human hand. They wanted something that wasn't a digital font. And that continues. It goes in waves. I think it's back again. But the other thing that happened is a lot of calligraphers got interested in the new digital tools and said, hey, I know how to make letter forms. I can make a typeface. And so here are some of the people, who ended up doing that. Some of them are well known in the type world, like Richard Lipton and Robert Slimbach and Jovica Veljovic and Zapf and others. They did one typeface and that was it. They satisfied their curiosity, or they just did the typeface for themselves. I could add a ton of names beyond this. So as a background to the worlds of calligraphy and type, when I joined the Society of Scribes in 1977, it was the heyday of ITC, International Typeface Corporation. Their typefaces were the dominant ones in the world of phototype. Digital type had not yet showed up. And the two biggest names at the time were Hermann Zapf, who had done some typefaces for ITC, and Ed Bengat, a former lettering artist and type designer for photo lettering, who was one of their lead type designers and did a lot of typefaces with his own name on them, and I thought that the world of calligraphy should be aware of the world of type design. I asked Ed Bengat if he would give a talk for us, and he agreed, I think at no cost. You can see we charged $2. And it was a great talk, and Ed asked me later on to meet with him, and he told the School of Visual Arts to hire me, and that's how my whole educational career got started. So Ed is my godfather. What you're seeing here is the announcement for it, set in Souvenir, the typeface everybody hated back then, the Comic Sans of its day, that Ed designed, and I think Tiffany for his name. And he redesigned the U so it could fit for this text. But we're not interested in lettering artists like Ed Bengat in type. We're interested in calligraphers. So here's Philip Bousma. You saw his Arthur Baker influenced calligraphy earlier, and he's also done sculpture, by the way. And early 2000s, I think, Philip began doing a lot of typefaces. I did in the 90s. He first did typefaces for AGFA, probably through Arthur Baker's influence, because Arthur had done some typefaces for AGFA. Arthur actually had done typefaces for phototype companies back in the 60s. So I'm not showing his work here. But Philip, after doing work for AGFA, did work for Canada Type, and I think he's now doing fonts on his own. This one I chose because it's rustic influenced. I tried to choose typefaces that had a variety of things. This is Julian Waters' only, I think, public typeface. I think maybe he's done some for private purposes. I think he did one to work with one of the books on Sheila. But this is Waters titling done for Adobe, which is a terrific typeface. Somebody recently said that online it's credited to Robert Slimbach. Well, that's wrong. Slimbach may have helped Julian with technical things, but this is Julian's typeface from start to finish. And what you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. The typeface has not only alternate characters, it has tall characters, short characters, all sorts of ligatures. It's truly one of the great digital typefaces. And you'll recognize some of Julian's calligraphy and certain features, and you'll see some of, there's certain forms that are very familiar. Gottfried Pott was one of several calligraphers who was asked by Linotype in the early 90s to do what they called type before Gutenberg, which was a really interesting name for the set because obviously there's no type in the West before Gutenberg. And what they meant was they were taking calligraphic styles historically and turning them into type. Karl Georg Herfer was part of that project, and Herbert Linz was his name. I forgot. There's another man besides Pott and Herfer is not well known. Gottfried did at least 2 faces in the group. This one, Duke de Berry, and I can't remember what the other one was now. Karl Georg Herfer did an Unschul, which is quite lovely. But this is a Betard from Gottfried Pott. And Robert Slimbach, most people know him as a type designer, but he's trained calligraphically. I've never figured out who his teacher was, but if you've seen any of his calligraphy, he clearly was quite talented in that area. And he got hired by Sumner Stone, who was trained as a calligrapher by Lloyd Reynolds at Reed College to be one of the first 2 designers at Adobe. And Robert's calligraphic background really shows up in a couple of typefaces, especially one called Poetica. In Poetica, Robert looked at all the writing masters, the people in the Kay Atkins book I talked about earlier, Righi and Taglienti and Palatino, etc. And from them, he distilled, all the possible letter forms. So, there are people who criticize it as being, sort of a mishmash of all these things, but it's not a mishmash because it all has Slimbach's own interpretation. They're not direct copies. I mean, if you look at the ampersands in the font, there's 50-something ampersands in the font, you can say, okay, that one came from that calligrapher and that one from the other calligrapher, but you can tell that they've been redrawn, and created to blend in. It's an astonishing typeface. The original PostScript version had, I think 11 different sets, and even in the current open type version, it's got multiple sets, so that many graphic designers have no idea, the brilliant treasures hiding in this typeface. The only regret is there's no display size version, so at large size is a little bit heavy, but someday Robert will get around to that, I hope. John Benson, best known as a letter carver up in Boston. He died last summer. His son has been running the John Stevens shop for a number of years. But John Benson was asked by Adobe to do 3 typefaces in the 90s, and I just chose this one. Simply his italic handwriting. And he probably was, I'm assuming he was trained by his father, and his father got some training from Father Kaddish in stone carving, but I can't remember who his father trained it with. But I've forgotten. Hermann Zapf, we know him mainly for Palatino or for Optima, but he continued to design typefaces or collaborate on designing typefaces up until, I think, 2008, and he died in 2015, so up until late years of his life. And in the 90s, he revisited a project that had been started earlier and kept stopping and starting because there were technical blocks to it. And it became Zapfino once they figured out how to get rid of the technical blocks with OpenType. There's actually some other versions of Zapfino out there. They tinkered with it, but it has four basic sets. You're seeing the lowercase for all 4 and just 2 sets of caps here. And it's like Poetica, another typeface that you need to investigate if you really want to appreciate it. Most people just use it out of the box, and it's pretty dull that way. Richard Lipton, as I mentioned, started working at Bitstream in type design in the 80s, and he's the only one of the calligraphers I know who started there at that time, who's continued as a type designer. But early on, he did a typeface, which I've put here because this is not Richard's own calligraphy directly. It's Friedrich Neugebauer's. This is based on a sort of script style that Neugebauer used for a number of books. And my regret about it is that Richard didn't design any alternate characters or any. But it's a lovely, for a simple one font design, it's quite lovely. Jovica, after he did his first typefaces in the 80s that were very sort of traditionally based but original, worked with Adobe on Expanto, I think based on ruling pen for the initial lettering. Retouched, redrawn. And Jovita's done a new script that I have only seen in letters that I've gotten in the last year. I don't know what the name of it is. It's even nicer than Ex Ponto. I've, I've got to get him to tell me what's going on. Tim Donaldson, a name most people may not know, for is still around. Tim, in the early days of Letraset, getting into digital type. Believe it or not, Letraset actually for a while did digital type. Did tons of typefaces for them, and then for ITC, which took over Letraset. I don't know what he's done recently in the world of type, but for like 10 years, he was just churning them out. And it's just too bad he was doing a lot of them before OpenType and the ability to have all sorts of alternate characters. This one I chose because he deliberately wanted you to see all the schmutz and awkwardness that ruling pen lettering can have. And the name Twang, I think, came from the fact that it's a homemade ruling pen, and it was a very flexible bit of metal, so it gave off a twanging sound when he wrote. But it's worth investigating Tim's work if you don't know it. And if you've ever seen him demonstrate, which I have not, I missed him at A-Type I in Brighton in 2008 when he demonstrated writing on the floor with giant brushes and stuff. I think it's on YouTube. Phil Grimshaw, who died young, student of Tony Forster's in England as a lettering artist, and apparently was able to do calligraphically influenced work. Whether he actually had calligraphic ability, I don't know. I only met Phil once at a dinner. But he did a number of typefaces for Letraset, along with Tim Donaldson, and this one called Ariba. There's Ariba, which has decorative strokes added to this typeface. But you can see how far away we are from traditional broad pen, thick and thin distribution. And so, thank everybody for putting up with this extended reprise. I'm thanking Judy and Barry and Maureen in advance, but we're going to have the panel in a minute. I'm thanking the people who helped me with images for the for the show. My last image, Alan Blackman passed away last summer, and I knew I couldn't leave Alan out of this overview, even though his work is not my favorite work. But when I came across Happy Birthday, looking through what was available online, I thought this is the perfect piece to end. I mean, it has Alan's sense of humor. I think it's a beautiful bit of lettering. I just love the idea of Happy Birthday made out of banana peels. So that's the end of the redone presentation. And what we did after the presentation was I invited three people, Maureen Squires, Barry Morentz, and Judy Kastin, to be a panel and to talk about some of the things I covered in the presentation. Maureen was invited because she was involved in one of the earliest calligraphy conferences, and I think one or two later. And also works in calligraphy in the art world. And that way, Judy is one of the early members of the society. Were you ever president, Judy? Or were you just always treasurer?
Treasurer, administrator, and workshop co-chair. Never president.
So, yeah, well, she was probably smart in that respect. I was never president either. I was workshop chair, exhibition chair, editor, corresponding secretary. But Judy and Barry have been members since the early 80s. I think Barry maybe almost as long as I have. I'm not sure.
I joined in 78.
So 1 year after me, okay. But Barry has been influenced by the British calligraphers and has been somebody who who works with gilding, and so I wanted somebody like that on the panel. And Judy's got a more institutional memory. I know she corrected me or added some information. We were discussing the rise and fall of the society last time. So the idea was to ask Maureen, Barry, and Judy about some of the things I covered, as well as what do they remember from these decades that I left out, either because I forgot or maybe just didn't have room. I noticed we took a little break after my presentation, and Judy, I could hear Judy mentioning, what about the calligraphy calendars?
Yes.
Judy, do you want to talk about the calligraphy calendars?
Right. Well, I think it was Pentalic started the calendars and asked Society of Scribes to edit the artwork. Eventually, Society of Scribes took them over and published them ourselves. It went on for I don't remember how many years. The work in the beginning was pretty straightforward, and as the years went on, got much more creative. So looking back at some of the old ones, it's you can
You
see progress in the change in.
Do you have any at hand you can quickly hold
I
up?
don't, but I yeah, we'll have to look this up.
The first one, I don't think was Pentalic. The first one was, I think, only four calligraphers. That Paul Freeman I might have,
Okay. Yeah.
because I recall there being, I recall Alice's contribution, which I remember what her lettering looked like, and I think it was just Alice, Pat Weisberg, and Paul Freeman, maybe? Or maybe I'm getting that confused with the small portfolio the four of them did. There was like, but I know Alice did some sort of calendar page early on. And then 78, I think, is the first with a date on it. So 77, and then 78 and 79. And Eleanor Winters became the editor somewhere.
Yes.
And
And then there was one where the theme was love. And I remember that, Paul, you gave a talk for Society of Scribes. I think I had asked you to do it and talk about how, why some pieces got in, why some didn't. And I remember you saying that, if there were 50 pieces that all said love rather than, some other text, they weren't all going to get in there. So you picked the best love.
Or there was going to be just boring to see the same word over and over again, maybe.
Right.
I don't remember that, but I do remember that that we were doing it, I think, on our own, and Pentalic might have been our distributor.
Yeah.
And then didn't you and Joanne take over?
No.
You took over the Speedball book.
Right. Joanne Fink and I did the two Speedball books, 1989 and 1999. That was for Hunt, the Speedball book that's been around over 100 years now. And we did the 22nd and 23rd editions. The latest edition was just the 25th. So, but that had nothing to do with the calendars. Yeah.
No, it kind of reminded me of the Speedball book going through several ownerships or whatever. And I didn't talk about the Speedball book in this talk. I did talk about it in the first one because it was very important, as a book in the 60s. And it was kind of moribund when you and Joanne took it over, is my sense. I mean, that it really hadn't changed in terms of content. And so in terms of the 80s and 90s, what you and Joanne did, I think is crucial.
Yeah, we really brought it into modern times. And it's important to know that was the book, the most available book out for calligraphers and sign painters. Rather than all the wonderful books that you mentioned, Speedball book was always there. And we did actually borrow a copy of the very first one from sign painter Mark Otis. The only reason that had survived, because these were always paperbacks, was somebody had taken the time to bind it in leather. So he had an actual first copy.
Oh. Well, I mean, the Speedball book was, I think, so widespread because it was available at art stores. That's where I got my copy in the 60s.
Exactly.
I didn't buy it in a bookstore.
Most people, it was their first book. Yeah.
What was your first book, Maureen, since we're just talking about first book?
Ralph Douglas.
Really? That's
Hmm.
cool. That wasn't my first, but it was one of the first, maybe 5 or 6 books.
Yeah, I had my first calligraphy class as part of a drawing and design course, and that was the textbook for the class.
Who was the teacher?
1964.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Book published in the 50s originally?
Um,
I thought my
Late 50s, early 60s. He was a student of Arnold Bank, and he basically put Bank's philosophy in his book in written form because Bank never did get around to writing his own book.
well, they sort of did. I have the famous Reed College sheets. Have you seen those?
I've seen them, but he never quite finished it. Yeah. Lloyd
Well,
Reynolds tried to convince him to do it, and I don't know why it never happened.
well, because some people are perfectionists. I suspect, like Edward Johnson never finishing his second book. But what Reynolds did was they photographed Arnold Banks' large wall
Right. Demo.
demonstrations, and they reproduced them in a small book. And I don't remember what other text there. That's a really hard book to find a copy of. I forget how I got mine. Um, I didn't realize Douglas was a student of Banks. I got the book because it was one of like the number of books that were available to me in Ann Arbor, university town, in the mid '60s was Speedball book, Ralph Douglas's book, um,
Maybe Donald Anderson.
Jan Chickel's
Yeah.
Treasure Alphabets, which I couldn't afford at $9. When I bought it, it was $75 years later. It's a reminder: buy something, buy it. Don't say it's too expensive. Um, I mean, even when I started, Lloyd Reynolds' book was not available where I was. It wasn't until Pentalic uh, republished it in the '70s. Jake Farron's book had not been done yet. My father found me Edward Johnston's book in Detroit. My aunt sent me Eric Lindegren's book,
Yeah.
2 of the 3, and the third I got when I went to college at Reed. I found the third, which was about type. So my aunt didn't send it to me, probably. I mean, the books that were available, I mean, were pathetic back then. I mean, there were others that if you went to a university library, you probably could have found Alfred Fairbanks' Speak and Writing books, maybe, or
John Howard Benson's version of the Rigi Palatino.
Yeah, that one was reproduced by Yale in the '50s and was still
Right.
available. But I bought it in college because Reed had a bookstore full of these things because of Lloyd Reynolds.
Hmm.
I didn't see it in Ann Arbor at the. Oh, I know what my other early influence was from the art store in Ann Arbor was um, Walter Foster's book on calligraphy.
Oh, yeah.
Walter Foster was a guy who published books on all sorts of art subjects, and he had one including with red cover with
Right.
big white bulbous letters that were not calligraphy.
Big paperbacks.
Yeah, and it was a paperback, and it was inexpensive, like $1.25 or something.
Hmm.
I think it's still out there. So, Barry, what was your first?
Well, of all things, it was Fred Eager's The Italic Way to Beautiful Handwriting. I was introduced to that by somebody who was just doing calligraphy as a hobby. I was on a horrible job in France at the end of '77, and this guy who was training me in the job was doing calligraphy through that book. And I had resolved to quit the job and come back to New York. And
It
immediately I
must have been
ran
a
out.
really bad France.
Well, it was, it sounded great in theory, but when you got there, what the job entailed was a nightmare. But it changed my life because I got involved in calligraphy. So as soon as I got back to New York, I ran out to Sam Flack on 20th Street, which is no longer there, and bought a set of Platinum fountain pens and Fred Eager's book. So I taught myself, and after 6 months, I said, it doesn't look the way I think it should look. So I made several calls to the 3 then extant calligraphy studios in the city and found out about Calligraphy Workshop. So my first teacher was Frances Manola, may she rest in peace. And in Calligraphy Workshop, if memory holds up, there was available at the time a set of printed broadsheets of Johnston's work of different alphabets. So I bought that, as well as I think my first book, other than Fred Eager, was Jacqueline Svarin's 22 Alphabet.
Yeah, that's a good one.
A good one. Yeah.
It was hugely influential.
So that was like 46 years ago.
But it's good you mentioned Fred Eager because I think when I was going over all the names for the first talk, I think I knew Fred Eager's name, but I just left him out. I mean, he was one of the people who saw calligraphy as italic and handwriting as handwriting reform, like Lloyd Reynolds and Alfred Fairbank, and Eager had a number of books out, not just one.
He had one out on layout and design.
Really?
I believe so. I don't have it. I don't have the other one either anymore. I loaned it to somebody, and of course,
Good guy.
grew legs and walked away. But I think he had something on layout.
I think you're thinking of Alan Ferber's book on layout and design for calligraphers, which is a horrible book.
Yeah, I know that book, but I think Fred Eager had something. Not sure.
Well, I can check on WorldCat later. So Judy brought up, what was not talked about, the calligraphy calendars, and I think I a little bit went past them because they weren't part of sort of the spreading of the word of calligraphy in terms of education, or the spreading of calligraphy as what it entailed, how it's defined. It just showed, that the Calligraphy Society was big enough and strong enough that it could start to do projects like that. I mean, of course, it was also a moneymaker, wasn't it, Judy?
It was. It didn't make a lot. With John Neal and Paper and Ink, did pick them up and sell them. Not as many as we would have liked, but they did sell, and they sold it. They would bring them to conferences, so people would buy them at a conference. It was a nice little compendium of calligraphy from calligraphers that you may or may not recognize the names of. Maybe you took workshops with some of the people who were in there.
And after that, first one from '77, I think all of them after that, simply took what people submitted, and therefore a lot of people got their first public calligraphy in the calendars. That you didn't know about them until you saw their work.
Right, probably, and it felt good to be published. That would give the people who submitted work and an up.
Yeah.
That piece I showed by Pat Weisberg about love from Shakespeare was from one of the calligraphy calendars, I think '78. So, Maureen, I've said several times during today that you were important in calligraphy conferences, and I gave just very short shrift to them in my presentation. I showed the picture from 1981, and that was it. Can you tell us more about how the conferences have changed from the early ones? I don't know what the last one was that you were involved in, either as a participant or an organizer.
It was in 1999, Writing Beyond Words, yes. I think
We'll start with the first one you were involved in.
First one was Philadelphia in 1982. It followed the initial one that Joe White ran in Minnesota. And that's when I changed the format from 400 people in one room to individual classes, morning and afternoon. And that sort of has pretty much stayed the variations on that.
To do that, you would have needed more teachers.
Oh, yeah. We had over 35 teachers in Philadelphia.
So the idea of the conference being a collection of classes, in a sense, is due to you.
Maybe.
But how many people attended that conference, Maureen?
In Philadelphia?
Yeah, the first one.
Oh, the first one there was
No,
400.
yours.
My first one was a little over 400. I think 420, something like that.
Yeah, I was there. I remember it being pretty crowded.
And I remember being a nervous wreck, wondering if everybody would show up, you know. But it was, I had known, because I'd been involved with calligraphy since '64, I knew who was who around the country. And a lot of those people showed up in Minnesota. So it was Roseanne Barrett and Karen Gilman and I sat together on the bus going home from Minnesota. And then Roseanne said, somebody should do this again next year. And we all sort of went, And she said, Maureen, why don't you do it next year and I'll do it the year after that? And that's how it happened. It was sort of somebody would pick it up the ball and go for it. And what happened was each area of the country would concentrate on what they felt was strongest.
So, 83 Chicago?
Yes.
That's where Roseanne was from, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And 84, I think, was California's first.
No, 84 was back in Minnesota.
Oh, that's right.
It was in 85.
Yeah. And then I did 86 for New York.
Right. And I want to say that my first conference was at Maureen's Philadelphia gathering. And for me and for the Society of Scribes, which I was representing, because back around 1979 and 1980, when the board was having elections, Paul, you were there, and you said to me, "Hey, Barry, why don't you be workshops chairman?" What did I know about this yet? But I said, well, okay, especially because nobody else wanted to take on the job anyway. So I took it on. But Philadelphia for me was, apart from it being a very good conference, it gave me an opportunity to meet so many of the names that I had heard of.
Right.
I made it a point to invite just about every one of them to New York. Not necessarily that same year, but over the next several years, they all came.
Yeah, I think the conferences were always a source for us for learning about other instructors that we never would have known about.
Right.
Without Facebook and all the other things that are available now, that was how we met people and saw the work.
Right.
And, yeah.
It was also a way for those teachers to be able to come to the United States. If they were going to a conference, they could then travel and do a workshop in some other guilds, before or after.
And the heyday of the growth of more local or more regional societies. And I made it a point to contact other workshops, chair people around the country. So we would pool our resources so we could afford to bring over people from England or Germany. And it worked, and it was great for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And it wasn't only bringing international instructors, it was also ones from our own country. But,
Sure.
We were in the East, we didn't know what was all happening in the rest of the country or Canada or whatever. So it was a way to meet people from all over and bring them and do a circuit or just bring them for ourselves.
Right. Well, it made it more affordable too. You could share travel expenses and just a year later the trip.
Yeah, that was the key, sharing travel expenses. I mean, trying to get Michael Harvey over initially, we had like 12 people showed up for his talk. And I remember, thinking, I put him up on the floor of my apartment because we couldn't afford, a place. But that's what always was nice about the traveling calligraphy circuit. At least what little I was on it was that, you stayed with people and you got to meet people, more than just at a workshop. And most of the time you got put up in a much more comfortable place than my floor. I ended up doing, some workshops in Washington and San Diego and stuff. Barry, I was laughing when you said that I asked you to be workshop chairman and you had no idea what it was. That's exactly how I ended up being workshop chairman before you.
That's how we wind up with any of these.
I remember whether it was Paul Freeman or whoever it was who said to me, "Hey, you're workshop chairman." End of story. I know. But that it gives you the chance, as you said, to choose who you would like to learn from or to hear, see do a workshop. So who are some of the
Another
people,
great,
Barry, that you brought
who
over
was some
these?
of the people? Oh, early on in 1982, well, I met Larry Brady there, and I brought him over, and I met David Meckelberg. He came over the following year. I can't, my memory doesn't go.
Engmeyer.
Ingmeier came eventually, I think a few years later. I mean, we couldn't have everybody at the same time or in the same year, I should say.
Right.
But, I kept the list going. But I wanted to say another great thing about the conferences was, at least I think it's still going on now, are the student exhibits, because there was a lot of really outstanding work being done by
By
people who
students.
I call the unsung heroes and heroines. Some of them were a little camera shy or too modest to really push themselves, and some were rather aggressive. They wanted to get out there. But via the student shows, we started to see a lot of work that we otherwise would not have seen.
Right.
So it was an opportunity for a lot of these other calligraphers who did not have the name of a Sheila Waters or Meckelberg uh, to really get out there a bit.
Right. And the other thing is the the end of the week show where people put out work from each of the classes.
Yes.
So that's when you got to see the output from beginning lettering classes, which may not have looked like much, but to the more artistic classes or the more adventurous ones, or some of the just traditional lettering ones. And when you saw the output of the work, you would say, wow, that looks like something I'd like to try, or that, I think society people would like. Who's that instructor?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the best things that came out of it.
Agreed.
I can't say much about the conferences because I only went to two. Once I started going to type conferences in the 90s, I couldn't afford to do two conferences in the summer. So I'm letting you guys talk about the conferences. When you feel you've exhausted it,
Well, I
move
think
on to
I've been
another
to
topic.
over 30, and something I always looked forward to. I only missed a few.
Yeah. No, you beat me. I've been, I think, 26 now.
Yeah.
So then before we finish, Maureen, would you compare the 1991 conference you did, the last one, to the 1982? Since we're talking about the 80s and 90s, we don't have to worry about.
You mean the 1999 one?
You said that was the last one you did, right?
Yeah, that was my favorite.
So how did it compare to the two earlier ones? I mean, what?
It was
Really?
smaller. It was a little more intimate. We tried something. We invited two poets to work with some calligraphers who would interpret their work, and then they talked about the fine art approach that they took to the interpretation, and the poet talked about their what inspired their own poetry. So it was a real interesting juxtaposition to see the poet's response to the art and vice versa.
That was memorable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because the poets had no clue what could be done calligraphically. So
Right.
it blew them away.
Mm-hmm.
I think the introduction of poets at some of the conferences initiated the introduction of more expressive calligraphy as well. I think people became more attuned to the words themselves rather than simply doing beautiful letters, but
Yes.
sometimes even doing an ugly letter if it was appropriate. And I know Brody has taught stuff along those lines. Certainly Thomas Ingmeyer did. I think Gene Evans and a few others.
The
And
Germans.
the Germans, yeah. And for me at least, it's made calligraphy much more exciting. So like
Yeah.
when I work with a text, I'm not interested in hopefully just doing beautiful letters, but I'm interested in really getting into the text itself. And that's difficult. But
Yes.
really to bring the words alive via the form is a great challenge.
Paul, you mentioned changing letter arts, calligraphy exchanged the calligraphy review to letter arts review. And Joanne Fink and I had done the letter arts tabletop book in 1994. And we use the name lettering arts because calligraphy was taking on a pejorative meaning related to envelopes and place cards and diplomas and things. Lettering arts became a broader topic. So I think we used it first because this was a tabletop book showing artistic expression.
Maybe you inspired.
Right. Somebody once said to me,
she was like, "I have no idea. I never asked either of them." But I think it was inevitable. I mean, that a new term was used, and this is a problem that we've got. A lot of areas where activities just broaden beyond their initial things. The word of graphic design, people argue over whether the term is relevant. Even advertising. My school was arguing whether to keep calling the advertising department because of branding and other things. And I've just gotten to the point where the word calligraphy means a lot of things nowadays, and I don't have a problem with people describe things done with spray cans as calligraphy or done with tablets or whatever. I mean, it's a short word, a lot easier than lettering arts. We'll call it LAR, don't we?
And then Society of Scribes. Nobody knows what a scribe is anymore.
Well, I'm kind of glad we stuck with
we
it.
know.
And SOS. I just call it SOS because it's a mouthful.
And if you remember, our newsletter was called Palimpsest.
right.
That was Lily Rocker's idea. And it was a great word, but a hard word to pronounce. And then you had to explain it to people.
Right. Good word. But
when I told somebody a long time ago, "Oh, I do calligraphy," and their response was, "Oh, you do that Bible writing?" Bible writing.
So we got off the word of palimpsest, given that we might have viewers for today's event who don't know the word palimpsest, PALIMPST. Refers to a manuscript page that has been rewritten. That is, the writing has been erased and new writing has been written on top of it. Normally with animal skin, though, it is possible with paper, a little harder to do. And with a palimpsest, what often happens is the original writing becomes visible over time due to or other changes or modern technologies of image analysis. And so palimpsests are very important in the history of paleography, the study of writing. And it was kind of an interesting title that Lily Ronker chose for the newsletter.
I think there was also a journal.
I'm not sure if she had any idea that we were going to be rewriting on top of the newsletter over the years or not.
I think there was also a journal or a newsletter at one point that was called Ampersand.
Oh,
yes.
Well,
I think from Minnesota, perhaps. And so there are some folks who know what an ampersand is, but try Octothorpe.
Octothorpe made-up word, Barry. We discovered that Robert Bringhurst didn't know.
It's a word that's used in typography.
No, we discovered in typography that Robert Bringhurst, who claimed it had a meaning, was wrong.
Huh.
I have to go look at the source. Apparently, everybody began using the word. It's hashtag.
It is a hashtag, yeah, but
well, the original. What was the original name for it? Number. The commercial ad, and it was a pound sign. It's a pound sign because that's what they called it on the telephone. But the word pound sign came from agriculture, from produce. But Bringhurst claimed it was an octothorpe, and he had something to have to do with the way fields were plowed or something. And somebody like 10 years ago went and researched it and said, "No, that's not true." I have not followed.
It was Strophodon that had something to do with plowing the fields, the movement of the cattle.
That's the Strophodon.
That's Strophodon.
That's a different thing involving plowing. This had to do with laying out different fields. Anyway, yeah, Bustrophodon is the cow going down the
Right.
one direction, turning around, going the other direction.
Exactly. That's
You're writing
Rose, the beta.
and read the other way. It's a brilliant idea, except if you start in the middle of a text, how do you know which way to read?
Yeah.
If your letters are symmetrical, H, the capital H.
I think we're getting a little off topic here.
Yes.
We are, Maureen. Before we go, I mean, the one thing that, as I said during the presentation, I thought was, the overarching aspects of those decades was the idea that calligraphy was an art, and it's never been my personal interest, but I think it's something which a lot of people have been influenced by and excited by, that they're not just doing a craft, that they're an artist and they can express themselves. And so I'd like to hear from any of you about that, because I'm not the best person to talk about this.
Well, for me, it was having first Thomas Ingmeyer come to New York. He introduced us to the pointed brush, I think, and to considering, you mentioned non-traditional and also taking an art approach from art techniques and art philosophies. Then Dick Beasley came, and you mentioned him as well. He opened our eyes to what he called the straight stuff and the other stuff. And Steve Skaggs came shortly after that. And so it was a combination of Dick Beasley and Steve Skaggs that opened my eyes to say, wow, there's so much more to this calligraphy stuff.
Was Steve talking about what he called polyrhythmic?
Yes. It was the idea that they were doing
that was the workshop, polyrhythmic.
Right. They were doing things that hadn't been done before and that we hadn't been exposed to. And we did take all the straight lettering courses. Barry and I took every workshop that was offered. That's what you did. You just took everything, whether you were ready for it or not, because you could absorb it and, use it later. But it was those kind of workshops that showed us there was so much more to learn.
Can you talk
also?
Go ahead, Maureen.
I think also it depends on what your background training was. I came to calligraphy from a fine arts background. And so working with a brush was sort of second nature and something I did right from the beginning. And so doing commercial work for me was always much more difficult than doing a more fine arts approach. So.
Yeah, well, many of us did not have the fine arts background, and that's another thing that I thank the conferences for, because I usually looked for something that wasn't offered locally, like stone carving or paper making. And when I took a jewelry making class in St. Louis, that changed my life. I started making all sorts of things, taking what I learned from design in calligraphy, translating into a whole new material. So some people came from one direction to the other, and some in the reverse.
Right.
But it's all in your head.
Right.
I did not come from a fine arts background. I came from a background in history and comparative literature, and I mean, I was a Shakespeare nut when I was 10 years old through Classics Illustrated. That's what got me started on Shakespeare. And then when I discovered the work of Sheila Waters, it just blew me away. Just the sheer beauty of the letters combined with the majesty of his texts, and people like Milton and Dante as well, and a few others, Tennyson, that just did it for me. So my work is rather traditional, but I bring my background in history into what I do. So for me, getting involved in illumination and gilding was just a natural step for me to take.
And Maureen, you go in the abstract direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Judy, you mentioned you learned all sorts of new techniques and approaches from people like Skaggs and Ingmeyer. Can you be more specific? I mean, one thing I mentioned with Dennis Brown was his layering of class, but there was also with Dick Beasley, wasn't there a layering of text?
He was using color
Yeah.
and he was coloring in the spaces in between letters, and he was making them go in all different directions. He was also probably the first calligrapher to start doing things on the computer. And at the second Philadelphia conference, he had a small exhibit in town, and it was some of his work on the computer, early days of computers. And people were standing there saying, you know, I don't like this. What is this? No, it's,
He was
and
he was a Renaissance man. He
right,
worked in every medium.
right. So he was, be ahead of his time. And we did learn a lot from him. The problem what that arises that people repeated his style, without incorporating their own ideas to it. So you could identify, this is a little bees, that's a little bees, that's a little bees. People
Yeah.
had to learn how to, use what you learn from an instructor and move beyond.
There were a lot of Beasleyets running around in the mid-90s, really.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
One
that's
of
not
the
that
one of the
different from.
reasons that Arnold Bank didn't share his work publicly is he didn't want little Arnold Banks showing up all over the place.
Well, yeah, see, that reminds me of Alice complaining years ago about little salters.
Hmm.
She felt that there were, but that's what happens. I mean, somebody teaches you something, you're going to find people copying it, and that's the way they learn. The question is whether or not they then advance beyond that.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Very often the problem that they're just copying without really understanding the foundation of it.
They may not have the ability to go beyond. So it's the true artists who can
Mhm.
move ahead.
We've got only a few minutes.
Just like I feel when that wave of so expressive calligraphy came about in the early 90s with color all over the place and flourishing and mark making, you could somehow, Judy, you and I have had this conversation, you could somehow tell, however beautiful some of it may have been, you could nonetheless tell who had a real
Studied
training
it.
in lettering and kerning and spacing, et cetera, and who didn't.
And
So
also, I
they
would add,
could
Barry,
masquerade by the use of a lot of bravura, razzle dazzle. But then when you really looked at it very closely, I don't know about this. But
Barry, is that I had some of the same reaction you and Judy obviously had. But I also often used to be disappointed, not just in the quality of letter forms, but composition. There wasn't a sense. I mean, you look at Karl Kurtz, you look at some of the other people. I mean, they have, Brody. There's a
yeah,
sense of things aren't just thrown in. But
yeah,
also, what I used to notice is that people seem to have tried to put in all the things they just learned at a conference or a workshop. I mean,
yeah, oh
okay,
yes,
I've learned colored pencil. I've learned embossing. I've learned, whatever sync art, whatever it is. All of a sudden, all of it is together in one place, like an encyclopedia or something. Well, and I think people, are still going to be like that, and it's hard to criticize them because as long as it's a learning stage, and people are eager to try out what they do, and they're not in a institutional setting anymore where you've got a bunch of classes and a bunch of teachers who could all advise you and give you feedback. Going to a conference and you got to wait till the next year. Going to a workshop, the next workshop might be not one where you can, build on the previous workshop.
Yeah.
Any last minute thoughts about any of the things I brought up? I know you said I was covering a lot of things, but I know that my views on things aren't everybody's views on things. If you want to, argue with me, challenge me, bring something else up, this is our
I
last
think
chance.
you've covered quite a bit. So,
Yeah. Right. I would just add that at the
certainly
height
did.
of Society of Scribes, we had about 1,800 members. And as the local groups started popping up all over the country, membership dropped because people didn't need to belong to New York if they had a group in Idaho or Arkansas or wherever.
A lot of that,
So
a lot of that drop occurred, Judy, because of Arthur Baker, because of the controversy in, what was it, 81 or so.
Later on. This was later on.
We had 1,500 members, and it dropped like to 750 or 800, like in a year. But I think you're that the growth of the local societies meant, why should you be a member of New York if you were in Minnesota? We had members who were in Minnesota and in Boston and in, all
over.
places.
Yeah.
And I think it's good that, it's unlike England, which for a long time was strictly the SSI, until Kloss, broke away in the early 90s, and then local groups in Plymouth and Oxford and, St. Point or whatever it's called, St. Port, began to show up. But if you look, I went to a website while preparing the talk on Sunday that listed supposedly all the societies in the world. I didn't see the one in Holland. Maybe it's defunct, but it was interesting. Basically, the societies were either in the U.S., most of them. After that, England, I think New Zealand and Canada. Because all those, any other country basically had one society, that was it.
Yeah.
One place they had multiple.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a number of the societies in the UK have been folding. There's a drop in membership. They don't have the funds anymore. Because I'm in touch with a few of them from time to time, and this is what I get the class scribe journal.
And I could be wrong, but I don't think in England the societies connected to each other. They were pretty separate, as opposed to here where we shared information, tried to, connect.
Well, one was a professional association, and the other was more of a teaching association, I think.
I just want to say, I think we're going to be closing in a moment or two.
Yes.
I have been mentoring a student in India, and I'm hoping that a lot of people, especially really qualified teachers, will see this online, this presentation that we've just made, and will take note of it. I know I wrote about it in San Francisco and Washington, and I think Minnesota published it, about mentoring somebody. This fellow, he's only 23 years old. He attended a lecture that even got the size of Italic 4 years ago, and he wrote to me about getting information. And I saw his Instagram site. This was somebody who had no training whatsoever, and I was blown away by his composition, his use of color. And he asked me if he could send me some stuff. So I said, sure. I was very impressed by it. I gifted him with a membership in the Washington Calligraphers Guild because he took a free lecture from them. He ultimately, and I went on to mentor him, and I still do. I meet with him on Zoom once or twice a month, and he submits work to me. He won the Hermann Zapf scholarship, sponsored by the Washington Guild. He won another scholarship for typography design, and he's also been studying with the wonderful Julie Wildman. And I'm bringing this up because this is the guy who did not have very much hope. He was very depressed when he started writing to me, couldn't get into a university over there, didn't know what he wanted to do. And now he has found his niche, and he is truly outstanding. He studied with Eve, with Christopher Hannes, with Carl Roaz, Julian and Elmo, and they all have been mightily impressed by him. He's, I think, the John Stevens of the future. So I'm saying this, that I know there are a lot of really excellent teachers out there. And if they would all just mentor one person who shows that interest and that ability, they will be doing a really wonderful thing, not only for the student, but for themselves as well. Because this for me has been very gratifying. And I sort of feel that if I drop dead tomorrow, I know that I've done at least one good thing in my life, that this guy has a future.
I think, Gary, that is a really good way for us to end this. Not just that it's our time is sort of running out, but I think that's perfect to talk about the future and to pay things forward. So I thank three of you.
If we could just also encourage people to please give back to your local guild. whether it's Society of Scribes or wherever you are that you're watching. If you want to see the future of guilds survive, we're counting on everyone.
Well, I would urge people to join guilds for the camaraderie and the friendship, not just for the mentorship and for the learning. I mean,
Yeah.
I haven't been to a workshop in years, but I go to events so I can say hello to people. I can see what people are doing. I want to see people in person, not just on Instagram or even on Zoom. As much as it's nice to see you three on Zoom, it was much nicer when we were in person in October. So thank all of you for being patient with my much longer than expected presentation and for sitting through it and giving me your opinions. I'll thank Fawn for doing the recording, and we'll let Fawn end the recording, and then if anybody wants to have any last minute comments before we sign off.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Fawn.
Paul. Thank you, Fawn.
Thanks, Paul.